let's rebind these illustrated editions of Lord of the Rings into these brand new leather covers. I decided to use the hardcover editions for this set. I much prefer making rebinds of hardcovers. They're much better quality, and I prefer it when the binding is sewn. Paperbacks just tend to fall apart in the end. These just make for longer lasting, better quality books. Since I'm putting so much time into them, they might as well last a long time. And a new skill that I learned this year is sewing end bands. I will never go back to using pre-made ones. This is the way to go. I love doing this so much. So I'm gluing on my ribbon bookmark, and then I use a leather cord and some tissue paper to create the base for my end bands. I just glued those on and I let the glue dry before I did any sewing. I have this really pretty dark blue tealish type of leather that I'm going to use for these books. Not the most Lord of the Ringsy color, but I actually think it looked really nice in the end. So I picked some colors to use for the end bands, and I ended up going with some shades of blue. Sewing the end bands, it's a really long process, but it's so satisfying, and I absolutely love the way that they turn out. I'm pretty slow at it. It takes me about 30 minutes to do one end band, so I have to do 2 on each book. This is majorly sped up. I'm pretty slow at it, but I like it to be really even. I like it to look really, really neat, so I take my time. Using the tissue paper to kind of hold the leather cording in place is the best way to do it. I watched a lot of YouTube videos on sewing end bands and did a lot of practice ones that failed before I figured this out. And this is just the way to do it. You just poke through the tissue paper, but it holds it in place for you. It just leaves way less room for error. Here's some real time to see how slow this process actually is. I'm going into the middle of the signature there to kind of sew it right into the book. Once all my end bands are done, it's time to pick my end papers. I also learned how to marble end papers. This is super fun, but it's a mess, so I kind of set it up and do a whole bunch of papers at once. That's why what you'll see in this video is gold, but I didn't end up using these gold ones on this set of books. I ended up using it on a different one. I know that there's proper techniques and proper patterns for marbling end papers. I kind of make it up as I go along. I've tried some of them, but I prefer to just swirl it around and see how it looks. And I think they turn out pretty good in the end. Marbling is really fun and I really like doing it, but it's a whole process. I usually set it up over a weekend and make a whole bunch of papers because it makes a mess in my house and I don't have a dedicated studio for something like that. So I picked my colors and I attached my end papers. I actually ended up changing the color of the end papers on the first book after I attached them, so you'll see a different color of end paper appears partway through this video. I don't really remember what happened. I think I ripped it or something, so I had to change it. So I'm just kind of tipping these onto the book and trimming them to size. I used to trim them before, but I've decided to cut them after they're on the text block, and everything just is so much smoother and more perfect. You have to be really careful though that you don't cut any of the pages. Did the same thing for the second and third books. And then I attached some mull to the spine, so you can see I have my end bands and my ribbon all on there. So the mull just helps hold everything together, and it's what's gonna hold the case to the text block in the end. And glue it in really well, press it, let it dry, and then just take it out of the press and make sure all is good. Here's my new color of end papers for the Fellowship of the Ring. Another skill I learned this year is how to use Adobe Illustrator. I used to do all my designs in Silhouette Studio, which was just not the best way of doing it. But learning a whole new design program is a big task. So this year I dedicated some time to it, and I just settled on Illustrator after trying out Inkscape and a bunch of different other ones. I do it on my iPad, and it is a lot easier and more convenient, and I have so much control over my designs. So I had been playing with these designs for a while, and then it was time to kind of fine tune them. I am pretty picky on everything being, symmetrical and all the same. So I went over this quite a few times and kind of redid it. And then I brought it all to size, made sure everything was in place before I cut it out. I then import this all into Silhouette Studio for cutting. I have two cutting machines. I have an original Silhouette Curio. I actually have two of them, but one of them is just a spare because they don't make them anymore. I use the Curio for scoring my chipboard before I cut it. I don't have like a laser cutter or anything like that. That would save me a lot of hours, but maybe someday. Right now, I do it all by hand. I find scoring it on the machine, it helps make sure all my lines are perfect and straight and everything is perfectly in place. I don't have to guess, and I don't have to measure, and there's no room for human error. The machine just does it. I have to cut it out pretty carefully with a knife at the end, but it works pretty well. And then I just kind of glued this onto a piece of cardstock as a backing, since otherwise it would have nothing to hold it together. I did the same for the back, and then I made the spine. I just used cardstock for the spines for these ones. Time to line everything up. I use these homemade spacers. They are 8mm for these books. Tape everything in really well. Also used just some leather to make some fake raised bands along the spine there. I just glued that leather on there. And it's time to apply the leather. I'm using a glue that's a mix of about 50-50 of PVA glue and nori paste. This works really well. It lets me kind of make sure everything is nicely in place, but I can get everything firmly in around those grooves. It gives me a little bit of work time longer than just using PVA glue. But this still takes a while. I'm pretty meticulous about getting in all the nooks and crannies. I like to have really sharp lines when I do things like this, so I'm pretty slow at this as well. And then I trimmed off the excess around the edges before doing my corners and turning it in. And then I'm going to let this book dry for a while. And then it's time to go back into Silhouette Studio and get my designs. So these are going to be cut out on heat transfer vinyl. I use the Cricut brand metallic foil for this. I like it. It's nice and shiny and it's pretty thin. It works really well on this leather actually. I've tried a lot of different brands. Pros and cons to all of them. And then I also have a silhouette portrait, which is what I use for cutting my vinyl. I find it just works better for the vinyl. The curio works better for the chipboard. Just a personal preference. Weeding the vinyl does take quite a while. I don't really mind this part. And I also like to do really small details, really small lettering. So on the back of each of these books, I have a quote, which is pretty small lettering. So weeding definitely takes some concentration. It's a bit of a slow process. Lining it up is the hardest, most stressful part because once you iron it on, there's not really any going back. I tend to measure a million times. I cut out like 6 or 7 repositions of this piece from this video. And then I do a little light iron to just kind of tack it into place before I apply even more heat to make sure that it's on there really well. Because this design has straight lines all the way around, if it's even a tiny bit crooked, I find that it's noticeable, so I'm pretty careful about making sure everything is nice and straight before I iron anything on. I've made that mistake before, and it usually just ruins the whole project for me. I'm sure it's something that no one else notices, but I notice it. Once my case is done, I'm just trimming the inside to make sure those lines are nice and straight. It just makes it look better once you've glued the end papers on. And then let's do a dry fit. Looks like everything is fitting nicely, so it's time to case it in. Using PVA glue for this. I always use parchment paper in between just to protect those pieces of paper. Always a nice fresh sheet so I don't get glue everywhere. This one took a little bit of repositioning. And then I like to press it down really well to make sure everything is glued in really well. I also try to prevent having any wrinkles or anything, so put another piece of parchment paper in it while it dries just to prevent any moisture from moving into the text block itself. And repeat the same thing on the other side. And then repeat this whole process for the other 2 books as well. I then had to press these books for a while. It turns out that they didn't fit in my little book press, so I had to break out my big one, which is actually one that my dad and I made during the winter. So shout out to Dad for helping me with that. It's quite a bit bigger, works better for big projects like this. Once that's all nice and dry, I do the lettering on the spine. I like to do this afterwards because I find it's so much easier to line it up, especially when you're doing a series and you want to make sure everything is nice and even across multiple books. I put this chipboard just in between the spine and the spine of the case. It just helps prevent the glue that's on the spine of the book from melting and sticking to the leather or the cardstock of the spine of the case. I've had that happen before and it's a bit of a nightmare. Here's my finished product. I forgot to film the little circles that I put in, but I ended up just cutting them out of mat board. I spray painted them black and then gold on top of that, and then inserted them into their grooves, which they fit perfectly because everything was measured on the computer. So time for some shots of the final product. I'm really happy with how these ones turned out. They're really beautiful and I love the illustrations inside. I find it just brings them up to a whole other level. Hope you enjoyed watching. Hope you'll come back if I ever make another one of these videos.